Betsey's going to tell you about the story of that terrible train wreck, the worst in American history, and second worst, right, buddy, in the world? Second worst in terms of deaths. So here's Betsey, a folk historian. Come on down.
Thank you, Jean. And I want to say a couple words about Jean. She also is an interesting person. I met her like in 2000, around 2008, when I first started researching this story, and she welcomed me into the world of women in history. And she was very kind. And she was I was starting to research the Trainwreck, and she was putting the finishing touches on her book, Clyde and Barney, which is a true, if you guys don't know, it's a true crime story based in Nashville and anyway, so she was finishing up that project and on to her next one as I was starting my first project. So it's just been kind of fun to watch her along her journey also. So thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you.
So before I talk to you about my book, The Day the Whistles Cried, I would like you to listen to my friend Joel Keller. He's going to play a song called Dutchman's Curve, which he wrote back at about the same time as I met Jean. Is when I first started researching the story. Him and a friend of ours walked. I had just discovered where the train wreck had happened, and we walked through Dutchman's Curve, and my brain was just full of, oh, this happened, and this happened, and this happened over here, and this happened. And a lot of the stuff that I told him at that day turned out not to be true, because I was just getting all these kind of stories. But Joel, in his infinite wisdom, managed to write a song that only gleaned the facts that turned out to be true. He did not include any of the false stories, the conspiracies, and all the things that I was collecting. So he wrote this in about 2008, and it stood the test of time, and he's performed it for me many, many times. So I hope you all enjoyed as much as I do. Do you want to come over here and have me turn the microphone? Okay. Yes.
Switchman left a green light up, the fatal die was cast. So forgotten the misfortune that came to pass at Dutchman's Curve. Just one track, two locomotives, too late to stop, no way to swerve. More than, thank you, more than 100 tragic travelers met a fate most undeserved. Fields of corn covered in crimson on either side of Dutchman's Curve. The worst train wreck in this old country is hardly known to you and me. I'll give the greatest was the lifeblood of the country at the time. So they cleared away the carnage, and the next train rolled on by. So forgotten the misfortune that came to pass at Dutchman's curve. Just one track, two locomotives, too late to stop, no way to swerve. More than 100 tragic travelers met a fate most undeserved. Fields of corn covered in crimson on either side. Dutchman's curve, God rest his soul.
I don't know if that microphone helped, but good, good.
It intimidated me.
Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Now you know the story?
We took that from her, so.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, like Joel really, really captured the spirit of of the train wreck in that song. So, forgive me here. So as he said, on the morning of July 9th, 1918, just outside of Nashville, 2 passenger trains, each packed with workers. I'm kind of reading this because I haven't done this in a long time, and I want to make sure I tell you right. They were running late, and they ended up on the same track, and there was two trains on the same track. And there was, the collision occurred, and it did turn out to be the worst train wreck in U.S. history. My interest in this story went way beyond the fact that it was just, 2 trains colliding on a set of tracks. It really is, like, when I first heard about the story, I wanted to know who were the people that were on the train, where were they going, why were they there? And most things that you read, they just identified most of them as victims, like the 100 and some victims. And so I kind of set out on a quest to find out who we can probably turn the PowerPoint off now. Oh, you guys want to keep seeing the pictures? Okay. All right. This is David Kennedy, who was the engineer, and his Tinker was his Chihuahua, and that was taken at the railroad apartments over on 18th and Patterson, which is there's a doctor's radiology office there now. But he ended up being blamed for causing the train wreck, but I just feel like he got I wanted to clear his name, and I wasn't able to, but I always just kind of had a thing for him, so. That's my buddy David Kennedy, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't clear his name. And he was a proud Irishman. Today on St. Patrick's Day, he would have probably been wearing green for sure if they did that in 1918, which I imagine they probably did. So, anyway, I digress. That picture caught my attention. Anyway, on the day of the accident, the community in West Nashville, which included an orphanage, farmers, a neighborhood filled with people it was like one of the first suburban neighborhoods, Sylvan Park area in the country, and people like that worked for the railroad. A lot of people that worked for the railroad lived out there, as well as just professional people who worked in Nashville but wanted to live in town but not in the city. So it was kind of an experimental neighborhood that still exists today. But I'm getting distracted by the pictures. I gotta quit looking at them because I want to talk about everything in the pictures. So where are we at? When the train wreck occurred and the community came out, it really shows how much the world's really changed. That's one thing I want to say is, like, if that happened today, we wouldn't be allowed to, like, rushed down. But on the day of the wreck, people came from everywhere, and they rendered aid, and they, I don't know why I'm so lost. Please forgive me. I'm going to start with what I know. Okay, so what made me write this book was, I'm really, I was really always interested in the history of my neighborhood. And when I moved to West Nashville, my husband passed away soon afterwards, and I was just kind of lost. What can I do? And so I started really studying the neighborhood, the history of the neighborhood, and I read a book by Sarah Foster Kelly titled The People of West Nashville, or the West Nashville, Its People and Its Environs. And on page 128, there's like 2 paragraphs, and it describes what was the worst train wreck in U.S. history had occurred somewhere in West Nashville. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And I've always been a fan of historical markers. So I thought, I bet you there's a marker to that. I'll go read the marker. And so I started looking around. I couldn't find a marker. And then I did something I'd never done. I called Metro Historic Association, and I asked them, is there a marker for I'm looking for the marker for the train wreck that happened in West Nashville at Dutchman's Curve. And I talked to a woman named Tara Melnick, who became my partner in crime after a while. And she told me, yeah, I'm sure we have one. Let me find out where it is, and I'll get back with you. She called me back a couple days later and said, I can't believe it. There is no marker to this. She says, why don't you get us one? And I thought, okay, I'm a waitress at Shoney's. I've never done anything like this. What do you have to do to get a marker? She says, well, you have to raise some money. At that time, it was $1,800. I think now it's closer to about $3,000 maybe. But at that time, it was $1,800. And you have to write a proposal that confirm, that shows like why this is important and confirms that it really happened. So that's how I started researching it, was to confirm, to get the details. And as I started researching it, these stories of all these people just started coming at me, and I really felt, and I know this sounds hokey, but I really felt like the people at Dutchman's Curve were asking me to write the story. So like, tell my story. I could hear people saying, I don't want to be called a victim anymore. Say my name, say who I am. So that set me on a quest just to kind of find their stories. And eventually that turned into me writing a book, which is probably, at this point, one of the proudest achievements of my life, is writing and completing a book. How many people in here have written books? I know there's some book authors in here. Isn't it a proud feeling when you get that book in your hand? So that's how it all kind of came about. I was really amazed at how interested people were in the story. I knew that I was interested in it, but like, I met people like Ralph and Wagner and Terry Coates. They were my go-to railroad people. As Terry always liked to say, he kept me from putting a caboose on the back of a passenger train. Why couldn't I put a caboose on the back of a passenger train, Terry?
We didn't put cabooses on the passenger train.
They only went on.
There are some exceptions.
They only go on freight trains, and of course everybody knows that, right? But I would call up Cherry and Ralcom both with like crazy random questions, and they kept me on track. So I'm glad they're both here today. People ask me often, like, why does this story matter? And I've been giving it a lot of thought. And one answer, I did a podcast the other day, and I just said it matters to me because it just it's a good microcosm of the people that lived in Nashville in 1918. I always say, I like to challenge people, and I'll say, come up with a historical event that happened before 1918. Give me a couple of days, and I'll tie it into Dutchman's Curve. And so far, I've been able to do that. Of course, now that I'm at City Cemetery, and instead of 118 people, there's like, or actually there's more like 300, because I tie it sometimes into people who survived. There's like 22,000 burials there, so I know I can tie anybody, like I can find any, a tie to just about any historical event to there too. But yeah, but at a deeper level than just being able to tie it into history, I think that it really challenged me to think about how people are remembered and whose stories matter. Like when I was going through all the stories that I collected for the book, and my editor was taking out a lot of people. She took a lot of people out, and it just, now looking back, it kind of makes me wonder like whose stories matter and whose don't. But we had to select people like that could represent a lot of other people whose stories were so like, and that's one thing that this story really makes me think about is like everybody's stories matter. In my opinion, we all have a story. You have a story. You have a story. You have a story, and they all matter. And I think that whenever you write a book about a whole, like about an event that really happened, you're telling the story of the people involved, and their stories do matter. So that's the answer that I kind of came up with for that. I thought I would read a passage from the book, but before I do, I just want to know, does anybody have any questions? Like,
the history. More of the history.
oh, more of the history? Okay.
How come the marker is by Aquinas and St. Thomas on the Richland Greenway, and it's not at Whitebridge? Where did it happen?
The collision took place right under the bridge there, like what they called,
Right.
now we call it the old bridge. Yeah, that's where the collision took, the train coming from Memphis had just barely cleared, well, some of the cars were still under it, and had barely cleared under the bridge, and so that's,
Okay.
the head-on collision really occurred, they say if you go to the St. Thomas parking garage and look straight down, that's pretty much, no, Terry?
Got it.
No?
Shit, I did the wrong thing.
Okay. But that's where I've been told that the collision happened, so,
Thanks.
yes.
And why were why were the trains scheduled so rushed? Obviously, with the plaque, it says X number of folks, especially the workers, African-American workers, were going out to the musicians plant, Old Hickory.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously they were traveling west to east. And why was it so rushed? And if you'll combine that with the whole 1918, what's going on with the war stuff?
Okay, so,
That way you can piece why it was a tragedy and why it didn't get on the news.
it did get on the news. I know that I'm gonna address that, then I'll get back to the main part of your question. People say like, when I first heard it, they said, it was suppressed, the story didn't. Well, I've looked at newspaper articles, San Francisco, New York Times, Washington D.C., and it was front page news. It lasted about 4 days. I checked when John Fitzgerald Kennedy, our president, was assassinated. He was on the front page for 4 days also. So, and I don't think anybody thinks that story's been suppressed. Like it was covered pretty thoroughly. We saw it all on TV. So I think that it's just the nature of news that, like things, they're big, they're on the news, and then another headline comes along. But it was covered in the news, even though it was the same story told. Like the Associated Press story is the one that we saw. But why the trains were running behind, I take Amtrak with my granddaughter almost every year. We go on a big train trip. Trains always run behind, number one. But at this time, the government had just taken over the railroads or control of the railroads, and so they were changing things. They changed things a little bit on how people, like whenever you get a new boss, and they change stuff, it kind of throws everything off. So there was a few things that were being done differently, like the way they check tickets, and just some rules and regulations were being adjusted a little bit. But when the train coming from Nashville with Mr. Kennedy, who I was talking, who was he was the engineer, he had instructions that he was supposed to wait at a place called the Shops, which is near Centennial Park. Before the trains merged, there was multiple tracks there, and he was supposed to wait there before he entered that single track for the train coming from the west went by. And for some reason that we can't explain, that we don't know, he didn't obey that order. He'd been with the railroad since the 1860s. After the Civil War, he was hired by the railroad. And he had never been reprimanded and he was known to be very cautious. So it's really my opinion, because I guess I want to get him off the hook, is that he had a medical event. That's the only reason I can think of why he didn't, but there may be another reason that I don't know. And once he was on that track and that other train was coming, there was really no off-ramp unless he had made it if he had made it to Belmead, and he was supposed to pull off when he got to Belmead and meet a mail train. If he had made it just to there, then the crash could have been avoided, but he didn't make it there. Did that answer your question? How are we doing on time, Gene? I saw you looking at your watch.
No, because I don't recall.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. All right.
Let me add to that. The shops were there at Centennial Park, and we kept auxiliary trains there. And that, just as Mr. Kennedy was coming in, an engine and a couple of cars that he was gonna ferry to Union Station went past him, and he just took that, we think that maybe he just took that train and just avoided him. That's the other alternative.
Yes, ma'am.
In the song, I believe I heard him say, someone left the gate open. What gate?
So that was, there was a flag. Okay, this is a railroad. I'm always glad when the railroad people are here, because I'm more of the railroad questions, I always have to make sure that I answer correct when they're here. But there was a flagman that there was a flag that was like to go or not go. Semaphore. And he went through that. He went through that when he should have stopped. He went on through that. Yeah. Yes, Sandra?
I want to hear you talk about what you're going to talk about, people.
The people. Okay, so thank you. So some of the people that were on the train were, there was a gentleman named Pat Nolan, he was also a railroad engineer, and I know a lot of you know Pat Nolan from Channel News 5, I believe. Channel 5. It's his great uncle. So, or his name was John Nolan. Pat Nolan is his nephew. But he was a very colorful individual, and he had driven the train that was coming back from Memphis. He had taken it down, and he was on his way back. And so he was in what they call the Jim Crow cars, which are at the front of the train. That's where the African Americans, men, women, children, that's where they all rode. It was the most dangerous car on the train because it was the closest to the boiler. But it's also where white men went to smoke. And so he was up there, he was in the front smoking. And he was just a real interesting, colorful, another Irish guy that was on the train. Also in that car was possibly my very favorite, Milton Lowenstein. He was he was 19 years old. He had just been drafted. He he worked for his uncle who had a merchant, you know, he was a merchant, sold clothes. He was on his death certificate, it said he was a traveling hat salesman. So he was coming back, or he was supposed to go to Kentucky on his last run to sell hats for his uncle. But the story is that, and he was supposed to leave the night before, Monday night. He was supposed to leave Monday night. But Milton got caught up in a poker game. He was supposed to leave around 10 o'clock, and as he had told his friends, his luck was with him. And so he stayed at the poker table all night long and gambled, and then got on the train early in the morning and was in that front car smoking when the collision happened, and he was killed. But there was just something about, like he was feeling lucky, like don't trust your luck, I guess. So, but the train also was filled with, the train coming from Memphis was filled with a lot of African Americans and white farmers who had signed a contract to work at the DuPont powder plant. They were still doing construction at that time, and they had signed on to work from July until through September till harvest time, because they were farmers, and that time of year your crops are pretty much in good shape, and you can leave. And so they left their farms in charge of their wives and their children to kind of just keep everything watered and weeded, and with the plan that they would be back in a few weeks for harvest. And a large number of, probably about 70 of the deaths, 60 or 70 of the deaths was among that group of people. There was also a lot of on the train coming in the Jim Crow car coming from Nashville. There was a lot of domestic workers, because what I learned was this was on a Tuesday morning, and in the field of domestic work, Tuesdays was generally the people's days off. So there was a lot of domestic workers that were on the train that were going home to like Kingston Springs, Pegram, Dixon, to spend the day with their family. And then they would come back that night so they could go to work on Wednesday. And then really some tragic stories there, because there was like one family that lost, it was like two brothers. There was two brothers and then two cousins that weren't brothers, but so like four young men of one, of one nuclear family. And then there was another family in Pegram who lost two sons. They were both on their way home. So those were the stories that really kind of fulfilled me, because I wanted to know about the people who were on the train. There's another man, his name was Douglas Bates, and his grandson is Douglas Bates III. He was a lawyer from Centerville, and his great-grandson, now Douglas Bates IV, they still practice law in the same office on the city square in Centerville. But he was on his way home after having conducted some business in Kentucky. And what's really interesting about him, he was a member of the Knights. He was a member of the Knights of Pythias. Not only was he a member, he was the leader of the Tennessee Knights of Pythias, which was a very large secret society, kind of like the Masons. And there were people that were pressuring him to run for governor as an independent. That was an election year. And his grandson showed me a letter that he wrote saying, "I would rather be the president of the Knights of Pythias than the governor of a little state like Tennessee." So makes you kind of wonder, what were they up to? But he was a very interesting person, and he was identified because they found his hat, and it had his name, monogrammed on the inside of his hat, and that's how they knew who he was when they found him at the train wreck. Another really interesting person was he wasn't a passenger on the train, but he worked for the railroad, was Dr. Duncan Eves, and who was a railroad surgeon. He lived on Whitaker, and he was there, and he was in charge of the overseeing the rescue, and he went on to have a very long career in Nashville as a doctor. The Eve building downtown across the street from the library, that was his family. So, but the people, they were just like, if you just look at by looking at the people's lives, I felt like I got a really good, you can get a really good sense of what people in Nashville and Tennessee were like at that time. One thing that really interested me with thinking about the African Americans that were coming and the white farmers. I gotta say, there was a lot of those too. It wasn't just black farmers, it was both. But like they would all been hired the day before by the government, the labor department, to work at the power plant. And I thought, how did these people from Arkansas and Mississippi, like how did they know to show up at this office in downtown Memphis on this morning to get this job? And it really bugged me. Like most of them, a lot of them were illiterate. They didn't, they couldn't read. So it took me about a year, but I tracked down a gentleman who was retired that worked for the U.S. Labor, and he'd written a paper about that period of time. And he explained to me that on July 4th, which was 3 days before they signed up to go to work, the government had sent out like 3,000 orators to 4th of July picnics to give speeches encouraging people to leave their farms and go to work for the government. I thought, wow, that's really cool. So anyway, I could go on and on and on about the people, but I see somebody has their hand up. Yes.
Who was the Dutchman?
Oh, that's one of my favorite stories. So that's another one that took me a while to find the answer to, but in the 1850s, when they first carved out that railroad line for a railroad company called, which is now where Dutchman's Curve, and when they first carved that out, they hired some German rock cutters that they had brought over from Germany just to specifically do that. And they really became integrated into the community. And when people in Nashville would talk to them, they would say that they were Dutchman. Well, people in Nashville heard Dutch. So in honor of those people, they started after the railroad opened up and after the lines was carved, there was a Dutchman's grade, which I believe meant it was like a hill. There was the Dutchman's Bend and the Dutchman's Curve, and they just started calling that in honor of the people that carved them. But what's really interesting is I was reading something a couple days ago for a project I'm working on at the city cemetery, and I was looking for a quote from, it was the slave narratives that were taken in the 1930s by the WPA, and they were interviewing a woman who had been formerly enslaved in Nashville, and she said, and one thing that we knew that during the war, if we could get down to Dutchtown, if we could get away and get to Dutchtown, we would be safe, because that's where all the German soldiers were, and once we got with them, we could get our freedom. And I thought, okay, so that wasn't just the people in West Nashville, it was other people calling there was German soldiers that were I think they were like mercenaries that came over and they were fighting, but they knew if they could get to what they called Dutchtown, which was where their tents were, I guess it was the first on the line, that if they could get into there, they would be safe. So I thought that was interesting. I just kind of confirmed what, like my story about the Dutchman's Curve. Yes, sir.
You gave the number of how many died. How many were on both trains and how many
Okay, that is, there's not records like we have today, but I think that when we sat down and did the numbers of like how many cars there were times how many people and the trains were, we came up with about 600 people total, including the people, including the people that worked on the railroad, because a lot of railroad workers were killed too. Everybody that was in the front of the train, they, the baggage men, the firemen, the people working in the mail cars, they were, anybody at the front of the train, it was very hard to survive. But so I would say about 500 people out of the roughly 600. But we don't know an exact number.
I'd also heard that the beginning of the train, the Jim Crow cars, were just pretty flimsy wooden ones, were further back, were better cars. Is there any truth in that?
Well, they were all made of wood, but I do believe, what do they say, the sleeper cars on the train coming from Memphis had the metal under, their underworks were made out of metal, but the rest of the cars were wood. I'm sorry?
The forms were solid.
The forms were solid metal, but all the other cars, everything, they were completely wooden, and they just collapsed. And I don't know if you saw any of the pictures up there, but they telescoped into each other with people inside.
I did an illustration, I was a traffic accident for the police department, so I did a lot of accident reconstruction. I did a reconstruction of thing, one of the cars, when I started looking at the photographs, trying to find where everything was, and I did a drawing, I couldn't find a car at all. That car just absolutely was splinters, it was torn up so bad. There was no car left, nothing. That's how bad that one was.
Yes.
When I think of a curve in a railroad track,
Mm-hmm.
I think that might be a place where an accident could happen, or if it was going too fast, it would, run off the track. Did that have anything to do with either the elevation or the shape of the track and curve?
Was the wreck related to the fact that it was on a curve?
Yeah.
I think it would have still happened if they'd been on a straight line of tracks. They still wouldn't have had anywhere to go. They would have just had more time to be afraid because they would have seen each other coming.
Oh.
That's my opinion.
Oh.
Yeah. I've been told that the trains had a combined speed of about 60 miles an hour. You got to figure the train coming. That's something I kind of question though, because the train coming from Nashville had plans to stop as soon as it was going to pull over when it got to Belmead. So I don't think that they would have been going like full steam ahead, but the train coming from Memphis was coming down off 9 Mile Hill, and most of its fuel had been burned up, so it was lighter, and it was just, I imagine it was going very fast. So, but even if they were going slow, it would have been a bad collision. The number of people that were killed in the wreck was another thing that was that we really went up and I know Terry and Ralph know this because they saw me change my numbers several times, but when I first started researching, I went to the Tennessee State Library and pulled up on the microfilm the death certificates from that day, and I just started, that's how I found out that Milton Lowenstein was a traveling hat salesman. But I came up with about 138 deaths recorded, which was higher than any number that had been reported. And so I started saying, I think there were, I was like, I know more than everybody else. I know more than those people back in 1918 that said 105 or 101. They didn't know how to count like I do. But a lot of those, what I finally realized was a lot of those death certificates said unknown, like the early ones. And then later on, like a few days later, there would be a death certificate, which I counted, and it would have a name in it. And I started noticing some similarities, and some of them were like kind of clipped together. And so what I think happened was when they started out with 138 death certificates, then as someone would come and go, oh, that's my brother, that's my uncle, and then they would write a new death certificate and identify them. And so I think some people had more than one death certificate. But what I eventually came back to was the official number that was reported in the newspaper, which was 101, because that I found the insurance forms on like how many insurance claims they paid out, and they paid out 99 claims to people for deaths, and they excluded paying out for the 3 people who were in the locomotive that David Kennedy was riding, the 2 firemen, because since they were blamed for causing the wreck, their family didn't get death benefits. And so I'm pretty sure that if there was 138, there would have been like more people claiming those death benefits. So I'm gonna go, I think that the insurance number is probably the correct. So that if you take the 99 and then add the 3 that they didn't pay for, it comes to the 101, which is what they said on day 1 of the wreck, so. Yes, sir.
You may have mentioned this earlier, but where were folks buried immediately after the accident?
It depended on who you were. So if you were a local person and you had a family, some of them ended up in Bellevue, some went to Dixon, Kingston Springs, others ended up at Mount Olivet, Spring Hill, Calvary, Greenwood.
These were names that were claimed by family members.
And then for the unknown people, the African Americans that were unknown, most of them were buried at Greenwood Cemetery in Nashville. The unknown, the people who were white who were unknown were primarily buried at Spring Hill, and which is something I just recently learned. And a lot of people came from the West and claimed bodies and took them home too. So the unknown people, they were just claimed by the undertakers that took them to the various cemeteries. The people who were injured, they went to all the different hospitals, and even like doctors who had like little infirmaries in their homes, they took some of them in also, because there was a lot of people that were like just hurt but not like, fatally injured. And so it really put a lot of stress on the medical community in Nashville. And an interesting thing about the rescue is the Nashville chapter of Red Cross had just purchased a railroad car, and that they had stocked it full of medical supplies, so if there was an event, a disaster somewhere, the train could take this car to different places where there are disasters, which is similar to the buses that, they have the buses now. And it had only been at Union Station a couple days, and so they filled it up that morning it was filled up with doctors, and it was brought out to the site immediately. So they had medical supplies and medical people on the scene immediately, in addition to the ones that just rushed out to the scene, because some of them lived in the area and they came out as soon as it happened.
How many people do you think were part of the group that came in? I've heard the number 50,000. That just sounds so high.
It does. That bridge is awful little. They say thousands of people, but the population of Nashville was barely 50,000 at that time. So, But people came from everywhere, and people do like to look. And a lot of people came not to help. Some people just came to look, but the first people that came were people that came to help. But I have heard that same number of 50,000, but there's just no way to verify that. But I just can't picture. I've been out at the I've been out on that site many times, and I've tried to imagine more than 1,000 people there at one time, and it's hard to, like hovering around the bridge and stuff. It's hard to imagine more than 1,000, but I'm sure there was more than 1,000. So that's a great question. Yes, sir.
As a result of the accident, is it known if new safety standards and procedures were figured out and implemented?
Yes, they eventually straightened out the curve. It was one of the features, and in the let's see, I think it was like 1924, somewhere around there, they switched over from all wooden cars to all steel cars, which was a real big improvement for safety. You can kind of walk away from a steel, if you're not crunched all together, you can so that kind of eliminated oh, and also when they switched from steam engines like that reduced a lot of fatalities, because for the people in the front of the train, if there was any kind of collision, with that fire, with that fire pit right there inside, that was very dangerous.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
How old was Kennedy on the day of the crash?
78. So he probably should not have been driving the train. He just had his physical with Dr. Eve Sr. The one that came out to the wreck was Dr. Eve Jr. I think it was Dr. Eve Sr. Anyway, he just had his physical, and he'd gotten a really glowing report. And there were people that kind of grumbled about that afterwards, saying that he'd been with the railroad so long that they were just kind of they gave him a better report than they should have. Yes.
What kind of communication was there between trains or with some center? How did they get there?
Just with the flags and the things that were along the track. They got their instructions at the beginning, and there was communication between the stations by telegraph and some by telephone. They just installed some. Telephones were just starting to be installed. If you see the pictures of the train wreck, you can see like at the site there's like fallen telephone lines. But between, once you were in the train, the only communication you could have would be visual from outside, like a flag up ahead or something which would be like a signal of that you would know what it meant. But there was not even from the front and the back, there was no way to communicate. Anybody else have any questions? Yes.
How did they communicate with families? For example, these people coming from Memphis, how would the families have even known?
Well, like some people had telephones, and I've seen some telegraphs that were sent to family members. Like someone would send you a telegraph and they deliver it to your house and just tell you this horrible news. And some people probably didn't hear about it for a day or so. It probably had to get in the newspaper, and then someone ride out to your farm. And someone would have to know that you had somebody, so that, and I imagine that the government also had records of the people that they had hired, so they probably notified families too. But nothing was immediate like it is today. Yeah. Yes, sir.
It seems odd to me that there were a number of African Americans, you said, that were farmers or whatever, and they were going to go work at the DuPont dynamite place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't they hire people from around here? I mean, Memphis is a long way away to hire like 100 people or something.
they did hire people from around here, but there was, a lot of the workforce was on their way to France. Like a big chunk of the workforce had been removed from society, and because I think the draft was from age 18 to 36, so that's your workforce. That's a lot of your workforce. Yeah, the same thing happened even with the railroad too. Like a lot of people that had been working on the railroad had been drafted too, and so they had untrained people working on the. But that's not why Kennedy did what he did, because he was definitely trained. But there was a big movement all over the country to encourage people, especially farmers, to go to big cities and to do construction and munitions work. One gentleman that was out at the wreck site, one of the first people arrived, was a man named Charles Ridley, and he was the head of something called the Nashville Defense League, and they were a group of they called themselves night riders, and they rode around at night, and they would check things like bridges and other buildings for sabotage. So he was one of the first people called out there. But another thing that they were to do was they would go out into the countryside and encourage what they called slackers and draft dodgers to either join the army or go to work for the government. And they would the word they used was encourage them and their families to make that sacrifice. So, does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Did you bring any copies of your book to sell?
I did. I owe you for that one, Ralph, and thank you. Yes, sir.
Since you tried to clear his name, how far along did you get with that?
I didn't get anywhere with it. There was, and everyone kept telling me, "You're not going to clear his name." I'm like, well, I just feel like I just feel like he really did get a bad rap. He was a founding member of the of Nashville's Knights of Columbus, and the night that the wreck happened, there's a little blurb in the newspaper that says, to my fellow Knights, we need to meet at the church tonight to determine what we're going to do about the memory of our brother David, our former brother David. They'd already kicked him out. Our former Knight, David Kennedy. I mean, they had already turned their back on him because they called him the newspapers calling him the blunderer, and they were just saying all kinds of horrible things about him. His wife and his daughters lived in a railroad apartment. They lost their home. They lived there for 20-some years. They lost their home immediately because he no longer worked for the railroad, and they just kicked him out. So I just felt like I just felt so bad for them. I really felt bad for them, and we tracked down some of his descendants, and when we had the 100th anniversary, that his family came out, but and they knew nothing about the story. The family had just obliterated it from their family history, and they were so fascinated and so interested, and we had we had a ceremony at Calvary, and a priest from the came out and gave him a complete mass, because they didn't even give him a complete mass when he died. So he came out and completed his mass with his family there. It was really nice. So, yes.
Was there litigation after all of this?
Yes, there was. And the first part of my book kind of tells like the day of the wreck, like what happened the day of the wreck, and then the second part of the book is based on the, somebody compared it to like watching Law and Order. First you see the crime and then you see the court case. But, it's based on the trial of David Kennedy's wife when she was she was suing to get her benefits. And it was very interesting, like how they eventually, I won't be giving too much away, but she was initially awarded by in the Nashville court, a settlement, but then Oliver Wendell Holmes in the Supreme Court later overturned it, so. But yeah, there was a very big, it went all the way to the Supreme Court.
You mentioned, conspiracy, what led people to think that there was some kind of cover-up about the wreck?
Oh, you know how people get whenever the government's involved with anything. So the government had just taken over the control of all interstate, travel, boats, cars, like trucks, and people felt like because this wreck happened under the watch of the government, that the government was suppressing news about it and not telling people the truth, and that the government was totally responsible. So that was the conspiracy for that, and that kind of lingered, that was still going around in 2007 when I first started researching it. That anti-government sentiment. Anybody else have any questions?